Hi, I'm Meredith and I work with a lab resource clinic doing encampment support. I was involved in like a protest encampment last summer that sort of sprang out of one of the Juneteenth protests. And when that finally for like the fourth time got evicted from the location that it was at that point. When everybody went home, there was a few people who just like were just there. We're not just gonna say bye now. When they're sort of trying to get by in a park with way less resources than they had 2 days ago. So we encountered a bunch of systemic barriers in trying to do that and got really frustrated with it and sort of tried to turn that into some kind of coordinated attempt to tackle those barriers. I know housed people who come across these exact same barriers and go, oh my God, I can't deal with this. Like, it's not, these things aren't easy. You can't like spend this much time with people without them becoming like your friends and people you care about. Like, it's just not, it doesn't work that way for most people anyway. So for a lot of people, better than living in a shelter, there's a lot more, just in my personal experience, obviously I haven't lived in a park or in a shelter, but just talking to lots of people who've had both experiences, there's a lot more community and like resource sharing, like people are able to support each other a lot better. One thing like to note if you're interacting with people who live in encampments or who live in public spaces is just to be aware of the fact that just because they exist in a public space doesn't mean they should be 100% accessible to you. It doesn't mean they're instantly going to be your best friend or that you should walk into their house or walk in presuming that you know what they need. Like, just as if you were approaching a house neighbor, like come to them, and maybe they won't want to interact with you and maybe they will, and maybe you guys will strike up a friendship, but that's not going to immediately happen just because they happen to live in your neighborhood park. There's a couple of layers to sort of invisible barriers that people face trying to get their needs met when they're already in like financially difficult situations, and especially if they're living outside. It's bloody difficult to access bureaucracy. Like, oh my God. We kind of start with, do you have ID? And the answer is usually no. And you're so limited in what you can do beyond that if you don't have ID. In Toronto, if you want to get social housing or community housing or whatever you want to call it, usually we call it RGI, rent geared to income housing. You need to have ID and you need to have your taxes done and you need to have managed to put in an RGI application. That wait list is like 10 years. The sort of emotional support and sort of like community aspects of what A-Lab does, like I think that those things are just intrinsically part of how we need to live with each other. But the sort of bureaucracy management and trying to like break down these barriers to accessing the things that people fundamentally need to be able to live, like I think that just goes hand in hand with food work in the sense that they both kind of derive from financial inequity. You get let down a ton. People say they're going to help you and they don't help you, or they do help you but it's way more complicated than you thought it was going to be. So I think people kind of get used to things not happening. Class tensions, I guess, between folks living in encampments and folks who also use those public spaces who aren't living in the encampments. So, I think that's interesting. That's sort of why this conversation about encampments has become so popular and covered by the media recently. So like it's this stuff that's always been there, but now you have to look at it. We've seen a huge influx of new folks living outside, living in shelters, because existing safety nets, which basically amount to working your ass off, have gotten pulled out from under them. Money is valued over people in a lot of ways, right? Like and labor is valued over people. Like you're, essentially reducible to your labor. And if you can't perform labor, then you're not financially viable and you can, you can go live outside if you like. I think leaving room for lower income communities to exist, for one thing, while simultaneously trying to limit the negative impacts of being lower income in the city, whether that's by limiting the number of people who are lower income through sort of changing the way that we relate to financial compensation and labor, or making more safety nets so that when people do, fall on hard times or have impacts that prevent them from, working as much as they would need to in order to be able to afford Toronto, that they don't, wind up in these difficult situations. The way we live from a labor perspective limits our ability to support each other in the ways that maybe I would like to see, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't give it a go. So that just means getting involved in your community in big ways or small ways, maybe joining a group that's doing some work that you feel is important, or just knocking on your neighbor's door and saying, hi, how are you? This is me. Sharing flour when it comes down to it, supporting your friends when they're going through a hard time, and sort of larger societal changes that you notice, staying engaged with those and paying attention to how those impact people, and exercising your will where you can to make changes that you think are good for people.